The Sega GameGear, a staple in the video game industry as it was Sega's first shot in the handheld market. The GameGear competed against the Game Boy, the Lynx, and the Turbo Express. But it promptly failed to make a dent in the market against the Game Boy. But what if it did? Hello everybody, GameBoy here. In today's video, I'm going to discuss what if the Sega GameGear was a success. So, sit back and relax and enjoy the video. Thank you. In 1989, Sega was pretty nervous. Sega recently released the Mega Drive in North America, to which the reviews were mixed. And their main competitor, Nintendo, had recently released a handheld system called the Game Boy. The Game Boy was an 8-bit handheld which could display games on a dot matrix display, or DMG. Basically, a portable Nintendo Entertainment System. The Game Boy exploded in popularity and was flying off shelves. Sega, seeing an opportunity in the handheld market, decided to create a handheld of their own. And in 1989, Sega started Project Mercury, a handheld system that would rival the Game Boy. And finally, in 1990, Sega released the Sega GameGear. The Sega GameGear was an 8-bit handheld with the ability to play games on the go. Basically, the Sega GameGear was a portable Sega Master System. The GameGear was an instant success, and many Sega fans bought the system. The GameGear had some many memorable games, like Gunstar Heroes, Columns, and most notably, Sonic the Hedgehog. The GameGear competed against many other handheld systems, which included Atari's Lynx, NEC's Turbo Express, and most significantly, against Nintendo's Game Boy. The Game Boy and the GameGear were both 8-bit handhelds, but the GameGear had some notable improvements over the Game Boy. The GameGear had a colored screen, compared to the Game Boy's monochrome display. The GameGear also had a backlit display, allowing users to play in the dark, while the Game Boy didn't have it. The GameGear was superior to the Game Boy in every way, but Nintendo had an ace up their sleeve. The price point of the Game Boy was significantly cheaper, costing $89, compared to the GameGear's $149. Also, not to mention the Game Boy could live off of 4 AA batteries for 30 hours, while the GameGear used 6 AA batteries and could only last for 5 hours. Even though the GameGear was a powerful system, the GameGear couldn't reach the levels of success to which the Game Boy did. In saying that the GameGear wasn't successful, I would be lying. The GameGear had its own core audience, and was even more successful than the Lynx and the Turbo Express. But it didn't really reach the level of expectations Sega was hoping for, and the GameGear was eventually discontinued in 1997, only selling around 11 million units, compared to the Game Boy's 118 million units sold. There are many factors that limited the GameGear's success, but to keep it simple, we will look at 3 main factors. One of the most prominent factors was the battery life. Yes, this was the most obvious factor. The GameGear was a powerful system, no doubt about that, but that came at a cost. With the GameGear having both a colored screen and a backlit display, the batteries would drain relatively quicker, and the GameGear's batteries would only last around 5 hours before dying, while the Game Boy's batteries could last around 30 hours. And for some consumers, that was enough for them to go buy a Game Boy. Another factor that limited the success of the GameGear was the lack of third-party support. There are many factors that led to this, but I'm going to go over the main one. Nintendo had domination over the gaming market in the late 80s and signed an exclusivity deal with third-party developers, locking developers in a contract making games exclusive on Nintendo hardware. This and many other reasons limited the GameGear's game library to 300. And the last factor that limited the Game Gear's success was the declining support from Sega. Sega favored home console releases and needed funding for new home consoles. So Sega decided to cut funding that was designated for the Game Gear and used it on their various other projects. This was the case when Sega took funding from the Game Gear to research and develop the 32X and Sega CD. Eventually, Sega realized that the Game Gear couldn't compete with the Game Boy, and so discontinued it. Those were the main factors that limited the Game Gear's success. So now, I'm going to simplify how those issues are avoided. The lack of third-party support will be pretty difficult to change because of Nintendo's contract, so I'm going to try my best to work with this. To get a little bit more third-party support, it's either that the strict licensing contract between developers and Nintendo is less harsh, which is probably unlikely, or the developers quit making games for Nintendo, which is also unlikely. It's either this or that, but whatever choice will happen will allow for third-party support for the system to be more active. And if Sega just had more dedication and support for the system, it would go a long way in the Game Gear's favor. Should Sega make less careless decisions that would waste money like nothing, it would definitely allow for proper funding for the Game Gear to continue to be active. Keeping the Game Gear alive with fresh new ideas could help the system grow in popularity. Now, my viewers, you might ask, now Game Boy, what do we do about the battery issue? And that is something I can't really change. I have some ideas concerning the battery issues, but those rely on taking out either the colored screen or the backlit display to slow down battery drainage. But I'm pretty sure Sega will have an idea on what to do. But that's how I think these changes will help the Game Gear grow in popularity and help them compete in the market. So with that, let's see what happens in this new timeline. In 1990, Sega would release the Game Gear to the public. The Game Gear would directly compete in the market against the Game Boy, Atari Lynx, and the Turbo Express. But with both the Turbo Express and the Lynx being too expensive and lacking real competition, the Game Gear would be the only true competitor to Nintendo's Game Boy. The lineup of games for the Game Gear would be great, and it would be bolstered by the many third-party developers who would develop games for the Game Gear. And instead of the Game Gear having 300 games in our timeline, this timeline would have many, many more. The Game Gear would sell well, but with the Game Boy having a better position in the market, it would still sell very well. But one thing holding the Game Gear back would be the battery life. Sega would start to think of ways to improve the battery life, but some of the options are either too pricey or dumb. But then, Sega gets an idea. Beware everybody, this is going to be unrealistic. Sega decided to create two new models of the Sega Game Gear. In 1993, Sega would release the dual handhelds called the Game Gear Color and the Game Gear Lite. The concept is pretty easy to understand. If you want to play in the dark and you don't care about the color, you could buy the Game Gear Lite. But if you want to see color and you don't care about the dark, you can buy the Game Gear Color. These Game Gears would both be at an affordable price, and better yet, the battery won't deplete quicker, as now the battery has less pressure from it. This would actually help the Game Gear sell better, as the consumers have more options to what they want to buy. Combined with the third-party support, the Sega Game Gear would do pretty well, selling many units. Nintendo would be concerned, but not to the full extent, making sure to keep their eye on Sega to make sure they won't flank Nintendo's position in the handheld market. But it wouldn't matter, as in 1996, Game Freak would release Pokémon for the Game Boy. Pokémon would explode in popularity, and many people would buy the Game Boy, and the sales of the Game Gear would decline. Sega would try to push out a game to try to rival Pokémon, but frankly, Sega wasn't in a good position to do anything. Finally, in 2001, Sega would discontinue the Sega GameGear. The GameGear would discontinue as a result of it being in the market for 11 years, and the announcement of Sega retiring from the hardware business. The GameGear would have sold around 25 million units. Sure, it couldn't sell more than the Game Boy, but it sure did put up a fierce fight. The GameGear will have its place in Sega history as one of the most successful handhelds, having many games and most importantly, keeping Nintendo cautious about the GameGear. But that's my take on what if the Sega GameGear was a success. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this video, then please consider leaving a like. If you want to see more what if scenarios, then please subscribe. If you have any thoughts on this video, then please comment down below. If you haven't seen any of my other what if scenarios, please consider checking them out. That's all for today, and I'll see you in the next video. See ya!